assume that you have read the story in Chapter 2 Alpha a number of times and that you are familiar with the content. You need to work through that story until you can understand it just by listening to me read it rather than having to look at the characters on the page. At this point, you're ready for the discussion questions in this video. I will ask you a number of questions and work through this material a number of times until you can answer the questions in Greek.
Πού εκβαίνει ο Δικαιόπουλης? Πού εκβαίνει ο Δικαιόπουλης? Ο Δικαιόπουλης εκβαίνει εκ του οίκου. Ο Δικαιόπουλης εκβαίνει εκ του οίκου. Τι ο Δικαιόπουλης καλεί? Τι ο Δικαιόπουλης καλεί? Ο Δικαιόπουλης καλεί Ξαντίαν. Ο Δικαιόπουλης καλεί Ξαντίαν. Τι εστίν ο Ξαντίας? Τι εστίν ο Ξαντίας? Ο Ξαντίας εστίν ο δούλος. Ο Ξαντίας εστίν ο δούλος. Άρα ο Ξαντίας πέφτει? Άρα ο Ξαντίας πέφτει? Ου, ο γάρ Ξαντίας εστίν αργός. Ου, ο γάρ Ξαντίας εστίν αργός. Τι ο Δικαιόπουλης καλεί τον Ξαντίαν? Τι ο Δικαιόπουλης καλεί τον Ξαντίαν? Ο γάρ Ξαντίας εστίν ισχυρός. Ο γάρ Ξαντίας εστίν ισχυρός. Άρα ο Ξαντίας πονεί αεί? Άρα ο Ξαντίας πονεί αεί? Ου γάρ πονεί, είμαι πάρεστην ο Δικαιόπουλης. Ου γάρ πονεί, είμαι πάρεστην ο Δικαιόπουλης. Πού εστίν ο Ξαντίας? Πού εστίν ο Ξαντίας? Ο Ξαντίας εστίν εν το οίκο. Ο Ξαντίας εστίν εν το οίκο. Άρ πονεί εν το οίκο? Άρ πονεί εν το οίκο? Ου πονεί εν το οίκο και νουν κατέβει. Ου πονεί εν το οίκο και νουν κατέβει. Τι κατέβει? Τι κατέβει? Ο γάρ Ξαντίας μάλα κάμνει. Ο γάρ Ξαντίας μάλα κάμνει. Τι ο Δικαιόπουλης λέει? Τι ο Δικαιόπουλης λέει? Ατεδεύρω ο Ξαντίας. Τι κατέβεις? Με ούτως αργός ήστι, αλλά σπέβδε. Ατεδεύρω ο Ξαντίας. Τι κατέβεις? Με ούτως αργός ήστι, αλλά σπέβδε. Άρα ο Ξαντίας επέρει αυτόν? Άρα ο Ξαντίας επέρει αυτόν? Ναι, επέρει αυτόν. Άλλου χέρι. Ναι, επέρει αυτόν. Άλλου χέρι. Άρα ο Ξαντίας νουν σπέβδει προς αυτόν? Άρα ο Ξαντίας νουν σπέβδει προς αυτόν? Ο Ξαντίας βραδέως εκβαίνει εκ του οίκου. Ο Ξαντίας βραδέως εκβαίνει εκ του οίκου. Τι ο δούλος λέει? Τι ο δούλος λέει? Τι ιούτο χαλαπός ο δέσποτα? Ουγάρ αργός είμαι, αλλά δυσπεύδω. Τι ιούτο χαλαπός ο δέσποτα? Ουγάρ αργός είμαι, αλλά δυσπεύδω. Τι φέρει ο δούλος? Τι φέρει ο δούλος? Ο δούλος φέρει το άρωτρον. Ο δούλος φέρει το άρωτρον. Πού φέρει αυτό? Πού φέρει αυτό? Oxantias feriafto proston agron. Oxantias feriafto proston agron. Pos o dikeopolis poni. Pos o dikeopolis poni. O dikeopolis alavni tusfus. O dikeopolis alavni tusfus. Tio dikeopolis leis fevde. Tio dikeopolis leis fevde. Mikros mengares tino agros. Macros deo ponos. Mikros mengares tino agros. Macros deo ponos. The chapter material in this lesson will contain a brief word study and then a discussion of grammar focusing on verb forms, proclitics, and the imperative. On page 13, number 1, what do despotic and chronology mean? Well, in English, despot is an absolute ruler. Despot was coined in 1562. Despotic, the adjective, was coined in 1608. O chronos plus o logos, so chronos, o logos, chronology. There we have time and the issue, the matter, the affair of time. So the study of time in English, chronology was coined in 1593. So number 2, what does a dendrologist study? Well, we already looked at logos, the study. The etis at the end, dendrologist. Estes there is the adjective, an adjective type ending we can put on Greek words. So dendron, we're left with dendron, that is a tree. So a dendrologist studies trees. Number 3, explain what a heliocentric theory of the universe is. So, Helios' sun, Kendron, is any sharp point, a horse goad, an ox goad, a point of a spear, a sting of a bee, a stationary point of a pair of compasses, a center of a circle. We can compare this to Latin centrum. Thus, the heliocentric theory of the universe is that the sun is at the center. Helios Kendron is the point. This is opposed to the geocentric theory that the earth, Yeo Kendron, is at the center. Number 4, what is a chronometer? That is a combination of chronos and tometron. And then, so what does tometron mean? Tometron is a measurement. So a chronometer is an instrument for measuring time. And here are a few other words that we have learned which have English derivatives. Elavni, we've seen that one before. We get elastic from that. Kali, the root clay. Ecclesia, ecclesiastic, ecclesiastical. That would be the called community. We've seen ego before, and Latin has a very similar word, ego, basically the same word. And these are derived from the Latin. Egocentric, egoism, egoist, egomania, egotism, egotist, and ego trip. On to the grammar section of this chapter, and it is quite full of material. The first point of the grammar section is verb forms, specifically the indicative mood and first, second, third person singular forms. We're first going to talk about mood, specifically the indicative mood. Now, the term mood might be a little intimidating since we use the word to describe emotions, which are difficult to define, and how many are there. But in grammar, the term mood is quite specific, and there's not very many. We have the indicative mood, the imperative mood, subjunctive mood, and optative mood. Then we have participles and infinitives, but those technically aren't verbs. So we only have 4 moods we really need to focus on in classical Greek. We're going to focus on 2 moods in this chapter, the indicative mood and the imperative mood, and each of them have very specific functions. The indicative mood is the most common mood used for verbs. It is a simple statement of fact, and so when you're telling a narrative or simply telling how you think things are, you're going to use the indicative. Thus, we'll see it the most frequently.
Now, in contrast to stating how things simply are, the imperative is used when we want to convey how we want things to be. So imperatives express commands, like do this. It's not how things are, but it's how you want things to be, or what you want to see happen. Greek uses verb endings to distinguish indicatives from imperatives. But before we can talk about these endings, we should review all of the parts of the verb, the root, the stem, and the ending. It's important to understand the basic parts of each Greek verb so you can anticipate contractions and what might seem to be irregularities. Now, unfortunately, this text, as most ancient Greek texts do, it conflates stem and ending, or sometimes stem and root. And the equivocation can be quite confusing, so I'm going to consistently distinguish root, stem, and ending. So on page 13, when they identify stem at the bottom, really we should cross that out and put root. This section is distinguishing three types of roots. We're going to have what I call noble roots, roots that end in vowels that don't contract with any stem or ending. Then we will look at verb roots that end in vowels that do contract with other letters. And that's the second group there, identified as phila. Finally, we will look at roots that take irregular stems. So the point of this section is to identify three classes of roots. We're going to add more types of roots to this collection, but for now we're going to focus on just three types of roots: noble roots, contract roots, and irregular roots. What we don't see in this section is the identification of stem. And that is because in the first, second, and third person singular forms, the stem and endings are contracted together, so we don't see them. Basically, in the diagram in your text, we see root, lu, and then what looks to be an ending, O-E-C. But really, within that O-E-C, there are two components, the stem and the ending contracting together. We do see those in the plurals. So on my chart here, I have the second person plural ending, te, for you all, or if you're from the South, y'all. Then in front of that, or between the root and ending, I show that there is this thematic vowel, or sometimes called variable vowel, omicron or epsilon. And we'll see those letters alternate, omicron before nasals and epsilon before other vowels. And so what we see here in our final ending, luete, is our root, lu, our stem, e, and our ending, te. The stem is showing aspect, an aspect of progression, which is used for the present tense, and that's all we've learned at this point. The ending is showing the person and the voice. Second person plural, you all, and it's active. You all are loosing something, versus a passive form, you all are loosed. That information is conveyed by various endings. Okay, let's take a look at what happens to phila when we add our stem and ending. Notice that the root ends in an epsilon and the stem is an epsilon. When two epsilons are placed adjacent to each other, they contract and form a digraph, and we end up with philite. And notice the accent is a circumflex here. Well, if we count back in the uncontracted form, we have our ending, one syllable, our stem, second syllable, and our root, the epsilon, third syllable. That would be the original antepenult. The Greeks wanted to keep the accent over the original syllable, but now the antepenult and penult have combined to form a new penult. To mark that, they keep the accent in that position, but use a circumflex. And that is the major difference between the regular verbs that we've seen up to this point and the contract verbs, the contract roots that we've seen up to this point. You notice that some verbs have circumflexes and some verbs have acute. Well, it's the root contraction with the stem that has been causing that. Our last root is the irregular root to be, s, there, which is the same root as the Latin to be verb, s. It is irregular, not so much because of the letters within the root, but that its stem is nothing. It has what is called an athematic stem. It doesn't have the thematic vowel, omicron or epsilon. It's just blank. And so we see the contraction there is este, you all are. Let's take a look at this process using another plural ending so we can really see the stem and ending separated from each other before we get back to the singulars in your textbook. So this ending, men, is the first person plural active ending. We all are doing something. Since the first letter of this ending is a nasal, mu, the stem is omicron. So when we connect those parts to lu, loose, we get luomen. Now let's look what happens to a contract root, phile. The epsilon and omicron contract together to form the digraph u, omicron upsilon. And so we end up with philumen. Notice the accent, the circumflex, over that contraction where the accent would originally have fallen. With our irregular root, notice again we don't have a thematic stem. There's just nothing there, so the ending connects directly to the root, leaving us esmen. We are. Now that you're familiar with how stem and endings work, we can discuss the first, second, and third person singular forms in this chapter. Let's start with the third person singular form that we have seen in our stories. It is actually a contraction between epsilon and epsilon iota. Epsilon is a very short vowel, and you will see it absorbed by digraphs and long vowels. So omega will swallow it, as well as epsilon iota. So our stem and ending in the third person singular is E. The stem is swallowed up by the third person singular ending. That leaves only the root and this combination stem and ending, lui. He loosens. However, with a contract root, we will see a further contraction. That epsilon of the root will contract now with our stem/ending, e, to form phili. With a long ultima, the accent can only get to the penult, phila, e. When those vowels contract, the accent stays over that syllable, but becomes a circumflex, phili. And that process will happen exactly the same way for every epsilon contract root that we come across. Now, when I told you that the third person singular ending was E, epsilon iota, that is true for the classical and Koine period, but earlier than Homer, the original ending was C, which eventually converted to T through some Atticism, but there's a long and wonderful tale about how this third person ending, T, became E, and a lot of that has to do with the thematic omicron or epsilon. And when we don't see it, when we have a verb root that doesn't take a thematic stem, it gives us a glimpse back into the archaic endings. And that's what we see here with ST. We have the stem is nothing, which doesn't contract with the old ending T. This simply leaves the root and the ending. And we see them now placed next to each other to form ST. He is. Now let's take a look at all of the first, second, and third person singular forms on each of these root types. First, we'll start with luo, a noble root. It doesn't contract with any of the endings, and that leaves us luo, luis, lui. The stem and ending contraction is O for the first person, is for the second person, and E for the third person. The same holds true for epsilon contract roots. They use the same O, is, E stem and endings, except the accent is over the ultima now, where the stem and ending contracted with the root. Philo, philis, phili. All of the epsilon contract roots will follow this pattern. It is essential that you master these stem and endings. O, is, E. O for first person, I. Is for second person, you. E for third person, he, she, or it. Because Greek will often not express the subject except with these verb endings. It is not enough that you memorize a paradigm, O, is, E. You must internalize these to such an extent that when you hear O, you simply think, I am doing something. O, Leo, I am loosing. And when you hear is, that sigma sound should bring up second person connotations. So as soon as you hear any verb ending with s, think you. The pronouns will follow this sound. The pronoun for you is su. So Luis is you are loosing, and that information about the subject, about you, should be immediate. You need to learn these forms so well and practice them so frequently that as soon as you hear Luis, the end of that word, you know who is doing it. You don't have to go through a process to find out. And the same is true for the third person singular form. Now for roots that take athematic stems, specifically the verb to be. There is so much contraction that goes on between the root and the ending. Remember, there is no stem in this situation, that it is simply best to memorize the entire paradigm for to be. And here we have the first three forms, imi, e, and esti. Imi is an enclitic, and so is the third person singular, esti. Notice that esti has a movable nu. You will always see it preceding another word that starts with a vowel. You will also see it in other places, but it is necessary when the next letter is a vowel. The second person form, you are, is not an enclitic. It will always have a smooth breather and a circumflex, just as you see it here. Let's review by placing these stem and endings on verbs that we have seen in our vocabulary and in the stories. So we will place all three of these personal endings on each of these verbs. We will start with verb roots that don't contract, regular roots. Ekveni, he goes out. With our three endings, I, you, and he. Ekveno, I go out. Ekvenis, you go out. Ekveni, he goes out. Elavni, he drives. So with our endings, Elavno, I drive. Elavnis, you drive. Elavni, he drives. He sleeps, kathevdi. I sleep, kathevdo. You sleep, kathevdis. He sleeps, kathevdi. He takes, lamvani. I take, lamvano. You take, lamvanis. He takes, lamvani. He says, lehi. I say, lego. You say, lehis. He says, lehi. He hastens, spevdi. I hasten, spevdo. You hasten, spevdis. He hastens, spevdi. He carries, ferry. I carry, ferro. You carry, ferris. He carries, ferry. He rejoices, hieri. I rejoice, hiero. You rejoice, hieris. He rejoices, hieri. Now let's practice our forms with contract roots. He calls, kali. I call, kalo. You call, kalis. He calls, kali. He dwells, yuki. I dwell, yuko. You dwell, yukis. He dwells, yuki. He loves, phili. I love, philo. You love, philis. He loves, phili. I will quickly read through exercise 2 alpha. Make sure you spend the time on this exercise to learn how to read it as quickly as I can and to understand it. Ton dhulon kalo. O dhulos ento yuko poni. Tion spevdis. Uki me argos. Ischerosi. Toarotron feri. Proston agron spevdo. Tikalis ton dhulon. O dhulos ugestin argos. O dhulos ekveni ektuuku. The second point in our grammar discussion is on proclitics. Proclitics are fairly easy. They are words that don't have an accent of their own, but instead lean on the word that follows them for their accenting. The only time there is an issue is when a proclitic is followed by an enclitic. In that case, the proclitic is leaning on the enclitic for its accent, and vice versa for the enclitic. It's leaning on the proclitic for its accent. So which one wins? The enclitic. When a proclitic is followed by an enclitic, the proclitic is accented. The first proclitic we have seen is the masculine singular nominative article, o. And there's also a feminine form as well as plural forms of these articles. The definite article is the word for the. Notice they don't have their own accent, and they lean on the word that follows them for their accentuation. So, Odigiopoulos is pronounced as one word. The same with Odoulos, but not Toarotron. The second proclitic that we have seen is the negation, oo or ook prior to vowels, or prior to vowels with rough breathers. Notice that there are no accents on these forms. This is a regular enclitic. It won't be accented when the next word has an accent, and will be accented if followed by an enclitic, except if that enclitic is a form of imi. When we negate a form of to be, that enclitic will receive an accent. So we will have ukimi, uki, and then we have a further exception when it's a third-person singular form of imi. Then the first syllable of that word is accented, and it's the only time that syllable is ever accented on imi. Ukesti. All of the rules regarding proclitics and all of the forms of negated imi can be found on page 286 in your textbook. The remaining proclitics that we are going to work with are the prepositions in, is, and ek. We have an alternate form of ek, x, before words that start with vowels. And then the conjunctions e and os. Os can also be an adverb. You will be able to tell all of these are proclitics because they don't have an accent of their own. They're not among the enclitics that we have learned. And grammatically, they function with words that follow them. Now on to exercise 2 veta. You need to translate all of these into Greek, which means writing them out and working on your accenting. Do not neglect your accenting or your breathers. You're going to have to apply your rules for proclitics and enclitics, but you can create a summary of those rules from this chapter and Chapter 1, Grammar 5, page 9. Stop this video if you have not already done your own work in composing these sentences in Greek. Then come back and check your work. Number 1. He, she is not hurrying. Uspevzi. Number 2. Why are you not working? Tiu ponis. Notice T has an acute even though it's followed by another word because the interrogatives, the question words, always have an acute. U does not have an accent because it's a proclitic, and it doesn't affect the accenting of any other word. Ponis is accented with a circumflex on its final syllable because it's an epsilon contract verb. Number 3, I am carrying the plow. To arotron ferro. We have a grav on the first word since it's followed by another word. And ferro is a regular verb with an accent on its penult. 4, you are hurrying to the field. You, I'm going to use is as my ending. Proston agron spevdis. Gravs on the ultimas because they are followed by other words. And spevdis is a regular verb with an acute on its penult. Number 5, he is lazy. We never want to start a word with an enclitic, so argosestin. Argos has an acute. It doesn't change to a grav because it's followed by an enclitic, which is virtually more syllables on the end of the word. Number 6, I am not strong. Ukis chirosimi. Again, we don't want to start with an enclitic. It's fine to start with a proclitic. It doesn't change the accenting of any regular word following it. And imi doesn't need an accent because it can lean on its preceding word for its accent. Here are some variations of word order. Ukimi, ischieros. Notice again we don't want to start with the enclitic. And when we negate imi, even though it is an enclitic, it will be accented. The same is true if we change the word order to ischieros ukimi. 7. You are not a slave. Uki doulos. Nothing strange here. The second person form of imi is not an enclitic. Doulos is just a noun with a circumflex on its penult. Number 8. The slave is not working. O doulos uponi. O is a proclitic, so it's pronounced with doulos. U as well is a proclitic and leans on the word following it, which is an epsilon contract verb. That's why it has a circumflex on its ultima. Udoulos uponi. Number 9, the slave is carrying the plow to the field. Odoulos feri to arotron proston agron. Nothing strange here. O is a proclitic. Doulos, accented where it normally would be, circumflex on the penult. Feri, regular verb, acute on its penult. To has a grav because it's followed by another word. Same with pros and ton. Agron does not have a grav because it's followed by a period. Number 10. He is not lazy. Ukesti nargos. Again, we don't want to start with an enclitic, so we'll start with our negation. This is the third person form of me and creates an exception in our accenting. It's always accented on the first syllable when negated. Ukastin orgos. We could have switched things around and started with orgos. Orgos ukastin. The third point of our grammar discussion focuses on the imperative. As I said before, the imperative mood is used to express commands. So in the text on page 15, spevde, hurry, fili, love, isti, be. The second person singular ending of the imperative, where you're just commanding one person, actually has no ending. It's blank. So all we have left then is the root and our atelic or progressive stem. For our noble roots, then, we have lue instead of all the contraction in the indicative, creating a long ultima. We just have our root and stem, lue. Our epsilon contract root forms also have a change. In the indicative, where we had root, stem, and ending, the earliest syllable that could be accented was the epsilon at the end of the root, and this, after all of the contraction, created a circumflex over the final syllable of the word. However, in this situation, if we count the uncontracted syllables back from the end, the stem being the ultima, the last vowel of the root being the penult, and the first vowel of the root being the antepenult, we can see that the accent for epsilon contract roots will be placed over the syllable prior to their epsilon, or prior to the contracted final syllable of the word, fili. So even though the stem epsilon and the final epsilon in the root contract together and form a long digraph, epsilon iota e, which is identical to the indicative form, we can distinguish the indicative from the imperative by the accent. The indicative he loves will be fili, and the command for one person to love will be fili. The singular command form of the irregular athematic root must simply be memorized, isti. Notice the accent on the first syllable. It is not an enclitic. I think exercise 2, Ka'ama, is pretty self-explanatory. Please do it. It focuses on the fact that imperatives may also have direct objects or complements. Also, notice how you negate an imperative. You use may instead of u. Let's look at the Greek wisdom passage on page 16. It directs us to page 70, which gives us further information about the 7 wise men who wrote many of these proverbs. Our passage is metron ariston. As we saw earlier in our section on word study, metron produced the English word measure or metrics, and it happens to have that same meaning in Greek. Ariston produced the word aristocracy, or the best. And so we have here measure or moderation, best. Will imply the verb is, moderation is best. That completes the units in this lesson. Please review them many times, especially the story and discussion questions regarding the story. And don't forget the workbook. Eruso.